The air in the airlock didn't just smell like metal and recycled oxygen anymore. It smelled like ozone and old, lingering fear. You know that smell? It's the scent of a room where a lot of people have panicked. My commanding officer, a four-armed alien named Krell, wouldn't even look me in the eye. His secondary hands were literally shaking as he handed me a simple silver tray. On it sat a bowl of bright blue fruit, something that looked like a cross between a grape and a glowing light bulb, and a small, flickering translation device. "One rule, recruit," Krell whispered. His voice was thin like paper tearing. "Never enter the Queen's chambers alone. It's the first thing they beat into our heads at the academy. It's the only way to stay alive. If you go in alone, you don't come out. Period." I looked down at the tray, then at the massive, obsidian black doors at the end of the long, silent hallway. The lighting was dimmed to a deep red. It felt like walking down the throat of a monster. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice from cracking. "Then why the hell am I going in by myself, Krell? Where's the squad? Where's the backup?" Krell finally looked at me, and I saw something worse than anger in his eyes. I saw pity, because, he said, "the Queen hasn't eaten in 3 days. The last 3 attendants we sent in. Well, we haven't found enough of them to bury." She specifically requested a human this time. She said she wanted to see if the rumors about your death world, Grit, were true. He leaned in closer, his breath smelling like sour grass. "Don't scream, kid. Whatever she does, don't scream. It only makes her hunt faster. It triggers her instincts." The heavy doors hissed open. The sound was like a giant snake waking up. Behind the doors was total, absolute darkness. It was freezing, so cold I could see my own breath. I took one step, then another. The click of my standard-issue boots on the floor sounded like a countdown. As the doors slammed shut behind me with a heavy thud, the silence was broken. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a growl. It was a purr, a deep, vibrating sound that I didn't just hear, I felt it in my teeth. It shook the very floorboards. "A human?" A voice hissed from the shadows. It was silky sharp and sounded like velvet dragged over broken glass. "I've heard your species is resilient. Let's see how long it takes for your little heart to burst from the inside out." I stood perfectly still. My grandmother always told me that if you encounter a stray dog, you don't run. You don't even blink. You just act like you own the sidewalk. But this wasn't a stray dog. This was a 7-foot-tall killing machine from a planet that didn't even have a name on our star charts. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I saw her. The Queen wasn't a bug, and she wasn't some slimy movie monster. She was a masterpiece of evolution. Her scales weren't just one color. They shifted and swirled like oil floating on water. Purple, deep green, midnight blue. Her eyes were the worst part. They were huge, glowing gold circles with pupils that were just thin black slits. She began to circle me. She didn't walk, she glided. Her long, heavy tail snapped against the floor every few seconds like a whip. Crack, crack. My heart was doing a drum solo against my ribs. I'm pretty sure she could hear it, but I didn't drop the tray. I didn't move a muscle. I just stood there, holding that stupid bowl of blue fruit like it was the most important thing in the universe. "You aren't shaking," she said. She stopped right in front of me. I could feel the heat radiating off her scales despite the cold room. Her face was inches from mine. Her breath smelled like cinnamon mixed with some kind of harsh cleaning chemical. It was overwhelming. The others, the brave warriors the Galactic Council sent, they collapsed. They begged. Some of them even died of heart failure before I even spoke a word. I took a slow breath. I remembered my life back on Earth. I remembered walking through South Philly at night. I remembered the time a grizzly bear wandered into our campsite in the Rockies. Humans come from a world where everything is trying to eat you, poison you, or stomp on you. We are the descendants of the people who didn't run. "I'm here to deliver your lunch, Your Majesty," I said. My voice was surprisingly steady. It sounded bored, even to my own ears. "And honestly, I was told you were hungry. It's pretty rude to keep a guest standing around in the dark while the food gets warm. Well, cold. Whatever temperature this stuff is supposed to be." The purring stopped instantly. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like it was crushing me. The Queen froze. Her golden eyes narrowed until they were just pinpricks. No one spoke to her like that. In the history of this outpost, no one had ever treated her like a person instead of a god or a monster. She reached out a long, slender finger. The claw at the end was black and curved, sharp enough to slice through a tank's hull. She placed the tip of it right against the vein in my neck. I could feel the cold, sharp point pressing into my skin. One twitch and I was done. She was looking for fear. She was waiting for that specific scent that prey gives off when they know the end is coming. She wanted me to beg. She wanted me to cry out so she could feel superior, but I just looked her right in those big, scary eyes. I wasn't thinking about the claw. I was thinking about how much I hated this job. I was thinking about the fact that Krell had basically sent me here to die so he didn't have to do the paperwork. Is there a problem? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Or are you going to eat? She leaned in even closer, her scales turning a dark, angry red. You are either the bravest creature in the galaxy, she whispered, or the most incredibly stupid. Why do you not tremble? I can see your pulse. I can feel the heat of your blood. I could tear you apart and the council would thank me for the entertainment. I shrugged. It was the riskiest shrug of my life. Look, back home on Earth, we have things called wasps. They're tiny, they're mean, and they sting you for no reason. Compared to a nest of those, you're actually pretty polite. Plus, if you kill me, you're just going to be hungry again in an hour. Why not try the fruit? The queen pulled her claw back. She looked genuinely confused. For a second, the predator mask slipped, and I saw a glimmer of something else, curiosity. A wasp. She repeated the word, her translator struggling with the Earth term. You compare me to a tiny insect. You humans are strange. You treat your lives like they are a joke. No, I corrected her, finally stepping past her to set the tray on a small stone pedestal. We just don't like being bullied, and we really don't like being told what the rules are, especially rules made by people who are too scared to come in here themselves. I turned my back on her, a move that should have been suicidal. I heard her tail twitch. I heard her scales rustle as she prepared to pounce. But I just kept walking toward the corner of the room where a small chair sat. I sat down, crossed my legs, and looked at her. So I said, are we going to keep playing the scary monster game, or are you actually going to tell me why you've been scaring the hell out of everyone for the last week? The queen didn't move for a long time. Then, slowly, her scales shifted back to a calm, shimmering blue. She let out a long sigh that sounded like steam escaping a pipe. The human stayed. She muttered to herself, her voice no longer a hiss, but a tired whisper. He actually stayed. I watched her for a long moment. She wasn't pacing anymore. The predator act had evaporated, replaced by something much more familiar to me, deep, crushing boredom. You know, I said, leaning back in the chair that was definitely not designed for a human spine. I've seen this look before. My cousin had a Doberman named Rex. Big, scary-looking dog. Could take a man's arm off if he wanted to. But if you didn't throw the ball for him for 3 days, he'd start tearing up the sofa just to get someone, anyone, to notice him. You aren't hungry for fruit, are you? The queen sat back on her throne, which was really just a massive, jagged slab of obsidian, and let out a sound that was half sigh, half growl. A dog. You compare the sovereign of the veiled stars to a household pet. If the shoe fits. I shrugged. You've been hunting the attendants they send in here, because it's the only time the doors open. It's the only time you get to feel like you're still alive. But the council, they love it. Every time you scare someone or make them disappear, it justifies their fear. It proves their point. They tell the whole galaxy that you're a monster so they can keep you locked in this basement. She leaned forward, her golden eyes flashing. And what point is that, human? That I am dangerous. I am dangerous. Sure you are, I said, dismissively waving a hand. But there's a difference between being a threat and being a prisoner. Think about it. That rule of silence, that never enter alone rule. It's not for our safety. It's a wall. They don't want anyone talking to you because if we talk, we share information. If we share information, we realize that the Galactic Council is full of it. The queen's scales shifted to a pale, thoughtful silver. She reached out and picked up one of the blue fruits, turning it over in her claws. She didn't eat it. She just stared at it like it was a bug. They told me humans were primitive, she whispered. They said your planet was a chaotic mess of war and emotion. They said you were too unstable to be trusted with high-level diplomacy. I couldn't help but laugh. Well, they aren't entirely wrong about the chaotic messes part. But here's the thing they don't get about humans. We live on a planet where everything is trying to kill us, the weather, the animals, even the tiny viruses we can't see. Because of that, we developed a very specific skill. We can spot a scam from a mile away. And this whole monster in the dark setup, it's a scam. I stood up and walked closer to her. I wasn't being brave, I was being logical. You aren't eating the attendants, are you? I noticed the vent in the back of the room. It's just big enough for a small, panicked alien to crawl through if they thought they were being chased. You've been scaring them so badly they run into the maintenance shafts. And then the council reports them as missing, presumed eaten. The queen's mouth twisted into what might have been a smirk. They taste like sour milk anyway. I wouldn't waste the energy to chew. But you didn't run. You saw the monster, and you asked for a seat. That's because I've dealt with middle management before. I joked. Krell and the others out there. They're just bureaucrats. They follow the manual. But humans, we read the manual just so we know which rules are the easiest to break. I looked around the room. It was grand, sure, but it was cold and empty. No books, no screens, no connection to the outside world. Just high-end rock and silence. How long have you been in here? I asked. My voice had lost its edge. I genuinely felt bad for her. Since the last treaty was signed. She said, 12 of your years. They call it protection. They say that because my species can influence the minds of others, I must stay in a shielded room for the safety of the collective. But the shielding works both ways. I can't hear the stars. I can't feel the pulse of my people. I am a queen of nothing. I felt a spark of that classic human spite starting to burn in my chest. There is nothing a human hates more than seeing someone, or something, put in a cage for no good reason. We spent thousands of years fighting for our own freedom. It's practically in our DNA to want to spring the lock for someone else. 12 years, I muttered. Man, I thought my lockdown in 2020 was bad. You've been playing Scary Monster for a decade just to keep yourself from going insane. It was the only game left to play, she admitted. She finally bit into the fruit. Until you walked in. Why are you telling me this? You could have just left the tray and ran. You would have been a hero back at the barracks. The human who survived the queen. Because being a hero is boring, I said, leaning against the obsidian wall. And because I don't like being used as a pawn. Krell sent me in here to be a victim. He wanted a reason to bring in the heavy mechs and secure this sector. If I die, Earth gets mad, the Council gets to go to war, and everybody wins, except you and me. I pulled a small, illegal handheld deck of cards from my pocket. It was a habit from my days in the Merchant Marines. What is that? She asked, her tail twitching with genuine curiosity. This is a deck of cards. It's a human invention for passing time and losing money. Since we're going to be here all night, and since the Council is outside waiting for me to scream, how about I teach you a game? It's called poker. It involves a lot of lying, which I think you're already pretty good at. The Queen looked at the cards, then back at me. For the first time, she didn't look like a sovereign or a predator. She looked like a person who had just found a friend in the middle of a graveyard. Lying, she said, her scales turning a playful shade of orange. I find that intriguing. But what do we wager? I have nothing but this room. Why wager the truth? I said, dealing out 2 hands on the floor between us. Every time I win, you tell me one thing the Council is hiding about this outpost. Every time you win. Well, I'll tell you about Earth. Deal? She lowered herself from the throne, sitting on the floor across from me. Her massive shadow loomed over me, but I didn't feel the cold anymore. Deal, human, she said. As the night went on, I realized the rule of silence was the Council's biggest mistake. They thought that by keeping us apart, they were staying safe. They never realized that the only thing more dangerous than a bored human is a human who decides to make a friend out of the person they were told to fear. By the 3rd hour, I had won 4 hands, and the things she told me, they were enough to start a revolution. This outpost wasn't a diplomatic hub. It was a siphon. The Council was stealing energy from the Queen's home system, and she was the battery, keeping the signal stable. They're using you, I whispered, looking at the cards in my hand. And they are using you to keep the battery in its cage, she replied. I looked at the obsidian doors. On the other side, Krell and his soldiers were probably checking their watches, wondering why the screaming hadn't started yet. They were waiting for a tragedy. They were going to get a problem instead. You know, I said, a slow grin spreading across my face as I looked at my hand, a full house. Humans have another saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I think it's time we showed this outpost what happens when the monster and the prey decide to team up. The Queen's eyes glowed with a new kind of light. Not hunger, not anger, but hope. I like your sayings, human. Tell me, how do we begin? First, I said, we're going to make them think the rule of silence was the best advice they ever ignored. And then, we're going to break those doors down. The sun hadn't even risen over the outpost's artificial horizon when the sounds began. Clank, clank, clank. It was the sound of heavy magnetic boots. Outside those obsidian doors, an entire squad of Council, peacekeepers, was lining up. I could hear Krell's voice, muffled but clear through the thick stone. He sounded like he was trying to hold back a celebratory tone. Prepare the containment field, Krell ordered. And bring the heavy-duty biohazard bag. We need to collect what's left of the human for the forensic report. Earth is going to want proof of the Queen's savagery before they sign the war declaration. I looked at the Queen. She was standing in the center of the room, her scales glowing a fierce, rhythmic violet. She looked like a goddess of war, but her eyes were locked on me, waiting for my signal. "Ready," I whispered. "I have not felt this much human adrenaline in centuries," she replied, her voice vibrating the floor. "Good. Now remember, don't kill them. Just make them wish they'd stayed in bed." The doors hissed. The seal broke, and a cloud of pressurized steam filled the doorway. Krell stepped in first, flanked by 2 soldiers holding high-voltage prods. They had the body bag open and ready. Krell took 3 steps into the darkness, his eyes scanning the floor for my remains. I didn't give him the satisfaction. I flicked a lighter, a cheap, plastic Zippo I'd smuggled in, and the tiny flame illuminated my face. I was sitting cross-legged on the floor, leaning against the Queen's massive leg. "Morning, Krell," I said, blowing a puff of smoke from a ration-packed cigar. "You're late." The Queen and I were just finishing a very intense game of blackjack. She's a natural, though she tends to bluff when her scales turn blue. The silence that followed was beautiful. Krell dropped the body bag. The 2 soldiers behind him actually tripped over their own feet. Their mouths hung open, their mandibles twitching in total shock. You're alive," Krell stammered. "But the rule of silence. She should have shredded you." The Queen stepped forward, her massive shadow swallowing the soldiers. She didn't hiss. She didn't roar. She spoke in a voice that sounded like rolling thunder. "The human stays," she commanded. "He has been appointed as the High Envoy of the Terran Union to my court. From this moment forward, this room is no longer a cell. It is an embassy. And according to your own galactic law, Section 4, Paragraph 12, you cannot enter an embassy without an invitation." Krell's face went from pale to a sickly shade of yellow. "This is impossible. You're a monster.
You're a biohazard."
"Actually," I stood up, dusting off my uniform. "She's a sovereign. And I just spent 12 hours looking at the technical schematics she has memorized. You guys aren't protecting the galaxy from her. You're using her nervous system to power the long-range scanners for this whole sector. That's a war crime, Krell. On Earth, we call that slavery with extra steps." I walked right up to Krell. I was half his size, but I felt 10 feet tall. That's the thing about humans. Once we realize someone is trying to play us, our fear turns into a very specific kind of cold, calculated anger. "Now," I said, poking a finger into Krell's chest plate, "here is how this is going to go. You're going to give me your master override key. Then you're going to tell the council that the human experiment was a success. If you don't, well, my new friend here hasn't had a real workout in a decade. I think she'd love to see how fast your squad can run back to the hangars." The Queen let out a low, predatory growl. Her tail swept across the floor, shattering a stone pillar like it was made of glass. The soldiers scrambled backward, their prods clattering to the ground. I can't do that," Krell whispered. "The council will execute me. And if you don't," I leaned in, my voice dropping to a cold whisper, "I'll tell the Queen exactly which wire in the wall controls the air supply to your barracks. Humans are very good at environmental hazards, Krell. Don't test me." Krell looked at me, then at the Queen, then back at the tiny human who should have been a pile of bones. He reached into his belt and pulled out the golden override chip. He handed it to me with shaking hands. "You've ruined everything," Krell hissed. "The council will bring a fleet. They will burn this outpost to the ground to keep this secret." "Let them come," the Queen said, her scales turning a brilliant, defiant gold. "For the first time in an age, I am not alone. I have the fire of Earth standing beside me." I slotted the chip into the wall console. The heavy obsidian doors locked, but this time I was the one with the code. I turned back to the room, which was now glowing with the Queen's light. "All right," I said, sitting back down and shuffling the cards. "The council fleet will be here in 6 hours. That gives us just enough time for one more tournament. Your Majesty, I believe you owe me 10 credits from the last hand." The Queen laughed, a sound that no longer sounded like breaking glass, but like a victory song. The galaxy had spent centuries trying to keep the most dangerous predator in the stars locked away. They thought they were smart. They thought they were safe. But they forgot the one rule that actually matters in the universe. Never give a human a reason to pick a side. Because we don't just join the fight, we change the rules of the game. By the time the Council's cleansing fleet arrived, they didn't find a monster and a victim. They found a fortress. They found a queen who had been unshackled and a human who had rewired the outpost defense cannons to target anything that didn't say, "Please." The rule of silence was broken forever. And as I sat there, watching the radar pips of the approaching fleet, I realized that my first assignment wasn't a death sentence. It was the beginning of the end for the old empire. Because when a human decides a monster is his friend, the rest of the galaxy should start running.